Hey there, how's it going? My name is Matt Doyle, and this is the Product Pod, and I'm here with my co-host, Adam Root. Hey, Adam, how's it going? And so today we're going to be doing an episode with some guests from a company called Runiq, who are doing layoff insurance for people who are affected by AI basically displacing their jobs. So I thought it'd be a really good topic today about talking around some of those AI tools that might be displacing people's jobs. So we're just going to have a conversation about the different tools that people are using in the market, and hopefully we'll find some good insight there, and would love to hear their opinions, seeing as they're dealing with the AI at the front end of affecting people's jobs. So we got Matt.
I'm Matt.
Who we got over here?
Harris. Jalen Dittman, linebacker, University of South Florida.
I love it. And so, guys, where should we start? I'd like to start with product-based stuff, like things like Figma Make or Lovable and stuff like that. So, Adam, you got any thoughts on those tools that people are using to build products?
Yeah, so I think let's start with Figma Make. I mean, obviously, you're talking about the ability to go out and now being non-technical or not even having design skills really to prompt your way to creating a prototype or at least the front end. And I think that's fantastic. I think what we're going to start to see in product is that product managers will really become a hybrid role where it's consolidated from product management, writing the requirements and doing the customer development, things like that, to being also the front-end designers and the engineers.
With Figma Make. And then on the engineering side, using things like Lovable to create the MVP. So we're going to see, because I see the same thing, we're going to see a consolidation of roles. So do you think we're going to lose, the front-end developers are going to lose the work, or is it going to be back-end developers or designers?
I think it's going to be both people in design and in engineering that will essentially... The junior developers, both front end and back end, will have a really hard time getting a job. I think that, product managers will be expected to do the first version of the MVP, and then senior developers will be expected to clean it up and really take it to the next level. But to get something shipped, I think that employers will start to really focus on product managers being the ones who can get the first version iterated.
I think so too. Guys, you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that, you got all kinds of cool tools coming out, and I think that it'll be interesting to see exactly which roles are starting to struggle first. I do think that, we could see a little bit in terms of front end, just because it does have a lot to do with, user experience, and product design has a lot that goes into front end. So I think that, it could be something where we see front-end engineers just focus a lot more on those. Obviously right now in the marketplace and for the last few years, we've seen product design manager, you see, a UI specialist, and these are all separate roles, full-time roles. We're going to get to a point where it's going to be interesting where it's if we have a front-end engineer who is really adept at using tools like Figma Made and stuff like that, why would you pay a whole nother person? And that's kind of the interesting question.
And I think these roles are always consolidating. Me and Adam had a friend called Hal, and I remember he asked me a question once. He was a back-end developer. Would you describe him as that, senior back-end developer? Mm-hmm. He said, Matt, what's your opinion? What do you consider yourself, a UX designer or a UI designer? And this is a good while ago now, 10 years ago maybe. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking, my answer to him was, well, I'm both. I don't really sort of think I'm either or. I think UI is more websites and stuff like that, and UX is more software design, but they're the same thing. So we saw, and now I think that's undeniable that that's the same thing.
Yeah.
But it wasn't totally clear 10 years ago. And I personally think you're going to see graphic designers upskilling themselves and using Figma Make and Figma Sites. And I want to make this clear, as someone who's used those tools quite a lot, they're definitely not up to snuff yet. Definitely not. Figma Sites is very basic. You can't even put in Google Fonts into Figma Sites at the moment. And maybe I'll talk about it in a second, because I used Figma Make to make a prototype, and I really ran into some stuff that this is as far as I could push it, because it started hallucinating and having issues. So that's what I'd say on those tools.
I think one thing that's interesting is the notion of, you mentioned hallucinations and things like that. I've also seen the problem with these tools is that they start to degrade after continuous prompts.
Yeah.
So
I think that's maybe what I saw more than a hallucination. Yeah.
yeah, so you'll put in and you'll say, okay, well, not this, but that, and it will struggle to redraw or recreate the part that you wanted in the same way that it was before. Whereas, if you just want to omit one part or, something that would be really easy if you were just using something like Photoshop or Figma or Sketch or any of these front end tools that designers would use, you just omit one thing. But we really struggled when we were trying to create that prototype just to remove that one little knob, if you will.
Yeah, I did a button that I didn't want, and I said remove this button. I was really specific, and it just broke the whole thing as soon as I was trying to do it.
Yeah.
I said, solid. That's it. It's good enough for what we want to show. It was about 2 years ago. I spoke at South by Southwest on, it was called The Future of No Code App Development is what I spoke on. And so this is 2 years ago now. And at the time we didn't really have GPT as it was now, Lovable as it was now. And I actually had people in the room that were part of the Airtable team that were in the room because they asked questions and they said, hey, I work for Airtable or I work for Figma actually. And they said, where do you think things are going in the future? And my answer was around this. It was like that. Obviously, I said it will be this didn't exist, by the way, so I feel pretty smart that I did say this now, and now there's opportunity to talk about it. But I said in the future, you'll make something in Figma, and it will just work. It will just be coded, and it will work. And we at the time, I think we'd just seen Figma starting to have the concept of components, because I don't know if you guys know much about React code, but like you create a component, a graphical component, and now you do that in Figma. It knows what how it should behave. So I think what I'm seeing with AI tools now is this split user interface where you chat prompt it, and then you maybe have the history of what's happened, and you can undo, which is what you definitely have to do in Figma Make. But you also need to be able to then manipulate that by clicking on, well, you can, on Figma Make, you can click on an element and say, I'm talking about this part, but you can't really move things around. Like they don't create clean components that you can then dive in and edit specifically. It'd be kind of cool if it actually married up with the Figma design a bit closer. So it was because even it took a Figma design for me and didn't actually interpret it perfectly. And that could have been my layer of naming conventions and stuff, but it's definitely clunky.
Well, I think that's the thing is like, these tools are either prompting or they're editing. And what they need to do is become some sort of hybrid. You're starting to see this with, ChatGPT and the Canvas element where you can edit documents after it's been created, similar to like a Word doc or a Google doc. But, in Lovable or things like that, you can only reprompt. The reprompting then causes a problem when you should be able to go in and edit that little code block or edit that little design or something like that to really go out and do it. Now, Cursor allows that, where you could go in and look at the GitHub file and then that's been committed, and then you could go in and edit. But I think, that's still really clunky. It's not really, prompting. It should be able to be much more like drag and drop, kind of like the no code tools you're talking about where, you'd have an element and you can move it. But I want to ask the Runiq guys a question here on this. What are you seeing in your guys' data that shows which roles are going to be disrupted first? Which ones are going to be the first to go? Is it these junior engineers or is it these UX designers, or what are you kind of seeing from your side?
Marketing is something that's certainly right now people are all really worried about getting replaced. You see a lot of tools trying to automate a lot of the things that they do. And then, as you mentioned, with junior designers as well, you see NVIDIA as well pushing a lot of talk about vibe coding, how they can do the work of 10 developers instead of just one using these tools. All right. With like Cursor, like you said, Lovables as well. So those ones are definitely things that are, I think, they're the more obvious thing, right now, where it's very clear how automation and AI can really affect those roles. And make people more effective. So I think those ones are right now specifically what it is, but I think eventually it'll start to be other roles.
Well, a Lovable has only been out for 10 months,
right?
So that's something to consider, right? It's like they're still just a baby as far as like what they can actually do. I mean, they're not even close. So it's like they've got a long way to go. I mean, obviously they're looking at their problems and they're trying to figure out how they're going to fix them. And one of the issues that we've seen that whenever we use Cursor, and this is like the way that I would explain it, is like it very quickly, the AI and the editing and the coding and everything, like very quickly does it lose the full picture so quickly. It's like you have a picture in your mind of what you want to do. You could write it down. You could make an outline for it and everything. And it's like AI doesn't do a good job of keeping things
Within the context.
And the problem is, we aren't the most experienced coders, but, we pick things up pretty quickly. And, we've built a few things doing that. And like when we use Cursor, even though we have, some experience doing this, I mean, they're basically advertising that beginners can do it. And that's just not true. And I'm not, that could certainly happen here, in maybe another year and a half, like with what you said, where it's kind of a drag and drop. I think that would be really, really beneficial for people, but it's not there yet. But I think that, certainly, I think the biggest thing is like, you don't always know exactly which roles are going to be replaced right away. You can guess, but, new tools are coming out every single day. So you can't really know for sure. What's more important is, you need to start looking at these tools if you're an employee and think, well, can I be better at my job with this tool? And if you can, start learning it, and it's like, that's like the best thing you could do,
And I think the best way to flatten the learning curve is picking tools like Figma Make over Lovable, I think, and push back on this if you don't agree, because with Lovable or these other tools, you get the code and you still have to go and like deploy that code onto GitHub or something like that and make it work. What I was really enjoying about Figma Make was it was already on a server with a domain, like a string domain that you could then override and you could deploy it straight away.
Oh, that's interesting.
And I think that's where you're going to see the winners come through, is the one, because like Lovable, I think will have to create their own like AWS infrastructure. So you host off them, you pay them to host, and that's when you're going to start. And at the moment, they're not a massive threat, but people like Webflow. Like that's what Webflow did, right, for websites. And at first it wasn't very enterprise friendly and not many people were using it. And now you can do some really cool stuff with it. It's way more advanced. And then there's someone else, before the cameras went on, we talked a bit about Framer, which I'd be happy to talk about because I've used Framer and I've been on the fence about the two tools as well.
I think that's a really good point about making something enterprise grade. What I noticed was, in executive leadership at enterprises, the big thing that they'd always want is enterprise grade, meaning, and you've seen this with Walmart too, you're the customer, is that maybe some enterprise wants it on Azure versus like Google Cloud versus AWS. And if they can't have that kind of controller on their own servers, then they won't adopt these tools. And so one of the things that I think is going to be really important is, let's take something like Bubble. Bubble, recently raised $100 million. They're a no-code tool, and now they have a prompting tool within their tool to create workflows and logic. But the challenge is like, whenever I tried to get that pushed for even just rapid prototyping, not even a production grade, enterprise grade solution, is that these tools would be challenged in the sense that because they are self-hosted on their own servers or things like that, we couldn't move them over to our server instances. And so therefore it was rejected. And so what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, like agree. But and the other element is not just, because usually that's the excuse that these enterprises have, is like, well, we can't control the server and stuff. And that argument is becoming weaker and weaker because they're like, well, we need to do this. And they never do. So they eventually that'll be the first thing to topple. But what is still a contention is people like Walmart that we work with, they don't want their team using ChatGPT because all that IP goes off into a black box that they can't see and know how it's learning. And they want other people learning from their IP.
That's a good point too. I've been seeing a lot of these legal tech tools. What are your guys', the Runiq folks, what are your guys' thoughts on legal tech, like Spell and, or I forget what it's called, but some Spell that, writes contracts and things like that for legal? Are we going to see attorneys and these new, kind of baby attorneys that just get, barred, go out and have jobs here in the next 3 years, like if someone's just starting law school?
Can I add something else to that question as well? And do you think we're going to see problems like we did in the early days of DocuSign, where people were questioning whether e-signatures were valid? Are AI contracts as valid or not somehow?
You mentioned a program. I didn't catch the name, but the one I know about is Harvey, which does a lot of the things that you described. I definitely think it is going to cut a lot of the positions at a law firm, let's say. Obviously, I don't think that career path is ever going to fully go away. You're going to need lawyers in some, case or in some instance. But it definitely, with a lot of the more menial tasks and a lot of time-consuming tasks, it definitely is going to automate that. So a lot of the work that paralegals would do, I think that definitely could be automated. And Matt, what'd you say at test?
So I said that when e-signatures first came about, with things like DocuSign, the biggest thing was like, it says like a stupid argument now, right? But people were like, that's not a real signature because a human didn't print it off and then write it. But actually, the case is actually they're more stable and more secure because it's geotagged. It's like they have to have logged in with their email address. So it's actually more valuable. So I'm saying, do we think we're going to see a bit of a pushback on contracts that are created with using AI and people's trust towards them and validity to those contracts?
I think you definitely could, because people still look at, whether it's something as small as, prompt management on ChatGPT or doing things in Cursor or Lovable, like we're talking about, where there's mistakes and they're kind of like big ones. So I definitely think there's going to be people who are doubting at first. But I think in the same way how you were describing DocuSign, you look back and you're like, it's silly. I think the product will keep improving itself, that one day that won't be an issue.
Mm-hmm. I see like fewer legal fees.
Oh, definitely that.
Yeah. So one of the things that I think is a big problem is not only the hallucinations, but the, for lack of a better word, reaffirmations of a user saying that something is wrong when it may not be wrong. So, when you're prompting something and you say, no, that's not right. And they're like, you're absolutely right. Here's what it is. And they're just reaffirming your bias.
Yeah, they're too nice to you, the AIs, in a way.
Yeah.
Do you find that?
Yeah.
The AIs are a bit too nice. I'm like, stop sucking up. Like I legitimately want some pushback.
Oh yeah.
You know?
Sometimes, if I'm trying to get ChatGPT to give it to me straight, I'll just be like, hey, if you don't do it, I'm going to go talk to DeepSeek.
Yeah.
And then it gives it to me straight. Yeah, it's kind of funny, honestly.
Now, like what we've seen recently, I think it was like literally things are moving so quick, right? It might be last week that GPT launched call recording. Did you guys see that?
Yes.
So like that's going to displace all of the call recording people overnight. That will just add standalone call recording. So I guess my question to the group is, it's like there's these master tools that are kind of trying to do it all. Are we going to see less trust in all these little tools that just do one specific thing? And the company's like, I'm not going to adopt this right now because it's going to be gone next week.
I think companies are they take a little bit of a different approach to that. I think like ultimately like what they're looking at is their bottom line. So it's like even if there is like a little tool that just does one thing that another company might do 5 things, it's like it's going to be like that company's genuinely going to care about how well that little tool does that thing for them. You know what I mean? So it's going to be, there's going to be a balance. I think they're going to be kind of constantly on the lookout. But I mean, a lot of these companies have been around for a while. So I mean, they know that sometimes tools come out that aren't really good. And if a tool can fix their problem and has been fixing their problem for a while, I think they're going to be a little bit hesitant to just switch over to something until they, it'll take some time for that trust to build, I guess is what I'm saying.
I think that's the big thing that I keep thinking about is, every enterprise that I've worked in or was consulting for, the biggest threat was it in SaaS, just putting that as an example, was it, a competitor to that SaaS company? It was, Susie and her Excel spreadsheet and her macros that she had or something like that. It was really hard to get anything adopted that was innovative because, in startup world, we always think about like, what's the best way, the fastest way to get something done? But in enterprise world, it's mostly you're dealing with what we call normies, right? where these normies just want to clock in and go home. They don't want to learn a new tool. They have a whole learning and development department that has to go in there and get onboarded, and then they got to learn it, and then they got to create all the material for it. Because the number one excuse that I always heard in getting adoption on a tool that we were trying to push through, or even one that I approved as a BPA product was, well, I haven't been trained on that. I hear that all the time.
I actually, I have a friend who I was speaking to just last week, and he was for the longest time, well, I guess the last few years, he's been a mathematics major, and he just switched his major to workplace implementation. And I was like, oh, that's really interesting, And he's like, yeah, so like what we're going to do is we're going to go into companies and we're going to help them basically do exactly what you just said. And I'm like, well, that makes a lot of sense to me. Like that's actually like, if you understand like everything that's going on with AI, you're like, well, I could see that there could be a big demand for that potentially. Like if there is a skill set of people being able to come in and get these tools up and running quickly, that's going to be really beneficial for companies.
Yeah, because the additional pushback you see is they want to consolidate their apps. They don't just want lots of little credit card payments coming in, because what happens if like maybe someone buys Grammarly through, you know what Grammarly is, right? Yeah. Through the company credit card, but so does Bob and so does Sally and stuff like that. And they find it hard to wrangle all these random tools, and they have even more trepidation about it if it's just random information leaking outside of the company. And then also to get consolidation, more and more people now are adopting those apps. Have you seen these apps, these enterprise apps, where if you want to delete someone's usage, you could just do it through one centralized location?
Oh yeah.
What are they called?
I've seen like these kind of procurement apps that allow, you know, IT or someone like that to go in there and delete that, or go in and even suspend a license and then add it to their enterprise license.
Exactly. So like that's been around for a while now, but it's like becoming more in every business. What was the other point I was going to say as well? It's also like you know, what's it called? Microsoft Exchange or what's it? What's their single signing thing called now? They just changed the name of it. Active Directory. There's a new name now, actually, if you do that. But like that means, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Active Directory. It's more of an enterprise thing, but it's a single sign-in for enterprise tools, and Active Directory is the Microsoft one. So more of these companies are going to have to integrate with things like Active Directory as well to be, I think, accepted into companies.
You know, that's a good point as well. Like with all these, you kind of mentioned this with ChatGPT going out and, you know, essentially stealing market share from these single tools that were going out and just being displaced. I'm wondering what you Runiq guys are kind of seeing as far as like, is there a lot of displacement happening from these early tools that were created and, let's say, you know, had 3 to 5 employees, but now they're having to go back into the workforce because they've been disrupted by a ChatGPT or Claude or something like that?
I think more recent news that comes to mind on that, and I don't know exactly what those kind of like, you know, the smaller AI platforms would be in this case, but Marketo got bought by Adobe to add to their portfolio of products, I think for $4.5 billion. So just something that helps with lead generation, and there's a lot of AI platforms that kind of specialize in nurturing leads. I mean, it being a part of that giant portfolio is definitely a lot more advantageous to a company that has a few more employees, just to have that whole platform.
Well, I think that's another thing that I always saw when I worked in enterprise was that, you know, even if Slack was better, let's say, well, we have Microsoft Teams and it's included in our license.
That's how they got market share.
Yeah.
And it's terrible.
It's terrible. I mean, these tools are terrible, but, you know, when you're going through procurement, even as a VP, you know, I didn't have authorization to go out and, you know, buy tools. I had to go through our procurement department, which that was a nightmare, right? So, you know, I would have to justify why this tool is so much better than, you know, a Microsoft tool that's included in our enterprise license. And 9 times out of 10, I'd lose, you know? So it's one of the things that I think about is like, how are these tools going to get adoption into the enterprise if you're having to go up against the procurement? And then also what happens and where should employees, for you guys, really focus their time on? Which tools should they learn that are actually going to be relevant for them to be hired at these enterprises?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's like he said, right? If Adobe just bought this, you know, it's like, maybe that's what you look for, is it's like, okay, well, this big company that's not going anywhere just bought this tool. So it's like, well, now I know that this tool is going to be adopted.
It tells me it's going to get worse.
You know what I mean? So it's like, it's kind of like, well, you'd be like, okay, well, you know, either Lovable or Cursor could be, maybe they could IPO eventually, or maybe they don't, and maybe Microsoft buys one of them. And now you're like, okay, well, let's say Microsoft buys Cursor and Lovable is going on its own. And you're like, well, now I feel like that's kind of the insight that we can be giving these people. Is like, well, to be honest with you, I think Cursor's safer now because it's like the exact same reason that you just brought up. So that's just definitely a very interesting topic and a way of looking at it for sure.
I think another way to look at it is, you know, if you are a competitor to Marketo or you're in the same field as another AI platform that just got acquired, you now have an option to maybe change the way your product is, coming up with a new base model that would better fit consumers who aren't these large, you know, conglomerates, you know, kind of advertising themselves as small businesses, trying to take that niche of the market, because if they can do that, the adoption might be so great that can catch up to those big firms that want to get into like the Microsoft package or the Adobe package.
It's like, you know, Cursor, Microsoft buys Cursor, and now it's like, okay, well, now you can expect any company that has over 500 people to likely be using Cursor. And then it's like, okay, well, maybe, you know, for lovable, it's anything below that. So it almost even helps us kind of decide, you know, okay, we can actually talk to these people now, and we can be like, okay, well, you know, what kind of company do you want to work for? Because I mean, some people have a preference for working for startups. So it's like, well, if you want to work for a startup, then maybe lovable is the choice for you. You know what I mean? Because it's like, well, if Cursor is purchased by Microsoft or something, it's like, are the smaller companies going to be using that, or are they going to be using whichever one's maybe more friendly for that? So it's just all information.
It's just something
really.
that's always rapidly changing.
Yeah,
and it's just hard.
And like consumers aren't paying attention to that.
Well, I think what's interesting is the thing that I put it akin to is, you know, when I was starting my career, I started as a developer and as a Ruby on Rails developer, you know, and then all of a sudden Ruby came out of, you know, fashion, if you will, and then now Go is like the big language. And so, you know, I keep looking at these things, and it seems like, where do you focus? Where do you go out and put your focus? I think one of the things that I always thought of is, and what I've been advising people is, well, if you want to go, to your point, work for a startup or something like that, you're probably going to use more open source kind of things. Like you're going to go out and use these frameworks that they're using. Whereas like if you're going to write code or be something for an enterprise, then you're going to go want to learn like C# and .NET, you know, but a startup would never use that, you know? So I think that's the thing that makes sense. But one of the things I would ask is, what are you guys seeing as far as, are startups paying more and giving better compensation packages, or are enterprises giving more better compensation packages, and which one should someone be going out and looking for?
I think it really does just depend on the role ultimately. You know, I mean, I know that there are benefits, you know, to both for sure. You know, obviously the risk with a startup is, are they still going to be a company in 2 years? So that's like one thing that you need to consider. That's, you know, a very real thing to consider. But we just, you know, we got a guy hired for, what was it called? Snorkel AI. Snorkel AI, which I'm not exactly sure where they're at, but they're still a startup. And, you know, they gave him an incredible compensation package. Yeah. And, you know, I think that one of the things you also look at is, like you were saying, with like, you know, the tools that startups are using. I think startups are more likely to be looking at the newest technology and trying to implement it, right? Mm-hmm. So if you want to work for a startup, I think that, you know, if you put that you already know how to use Lovable on your application, I would imagine that is actually going to get you much further, because like, oh, he's already focused on the new stuff that's coming out. Like, we plan on being innovative because we're a startup. So it's like, if you know the new stuff, I mean, that's what innovation is. It's the new stuff. So it's kind of like, you know, that's one of the benefits you're going to have with that. And I think with the larger companies, obviously you have the benefit that they're probably not going to go out of business, you know, in 2 years. So like, that's one thing that you have as a benefit. There's also a lot more information on them too. You know, if you were going to like look up like what kind of culture a startup has, I mean, there is such a thing as startup culture, which, you know, may be similar across all startups, but there's also going to be little things, right? Whereas if you go to a big company, you can look up on Glassdoor and you can pretty much figure exactly what benefits they have, you know, more information and stuff like that.
Well, I mean, I think with the tools they use, it really matters depending on their motivation. Where enterprise, like you had mentioned, IP is a real concern, a little bit more of a concern with, you know, they're not going to be using open source stuff as much, right? So some of these tools like Cursor, you know, security is a concern right now specifically. Like, you probably wouldn't want somebody who's working in the NSA to be using Cursor right now. Now, that may change in the future, but right now, that's kind of a concern. Whereas whenever you're using some more fast-moving companies and everything like that, you know, obviously they're going to be more apt to use, you know, open source software or stuff like that.
And one of the things that I think that we've had the ability to see as well, because if I was ever going to, like, if I went to the 9 to 5, like tomorrow, and I'm like, I'm going to go into a career, one of the things that I would be thinking about is, okay, and this is kind of crazy, and I don't think anybody thinks about it this way, but I definitely would after everything we've learned, is, all right, if I accept this job, what is this going to do for me for my next job?
Oh, that's good.
And no one thinks about that. But it's like, what we've seen a lot of is like, people, like, if you're going to get a job in startups, almost always they want you to have startup experience. So it's like, you know, if you're going that route, like, it might be hard to get out of that route, you know? So that's something to consider as well. It's like, if Snorkel AI ends up being this huge company, then yeah, you might be able to go over to Microsoft from there. But if they don't, you're probably going back to another startup. At least that's where you're going to be able to fit in the most.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I had a friend of mine, I can't remember what startup he was working for. He was working for a startup and it got quite big. But but then he moved to Google because he thought, oh, well, Google's a safe place to go to. So he moved to Google, and he said to me, I wish I hadn't left that company, because now I'd be in like a more senior role, and it wouldn't necessarily be more money, but it would just be so much better for my career if I'd stuck in with that startup rather than jumped into the corporate. Because he thought that's the end goal, surely, to get into one of these big companies like Google and get great healthcare and stuff like that. But that's not necessarily a good thing, because you're not being exposed to those things, these products and these fast growing things. Because even in an innovative company such as Google, because Google used to pride themselves on innovation, didn't they? And they'd have like a day off a week or something, wouldn't they, where you could build your own stuff.
Yeah, the 20% rule.
20% rule. Are you familiar with that, guys?
No, actually.
Adam, you tell us.
Yeah, so the 20% rule at Google was, essentially 20% of your time should be focused on a project that you want to do. It could be anything. And so that's how they came up with like Google Maps and these other kind of tools, essentially were these side projects from Google employees where they would use their 20% time to go out there and create that. But one of the things that I keep thinking about, and I want to circle back to, is Matt brought up a really good point on, going out and saying like startups versus enterprise. What I'm curious about is, and you brought this up as well, what is the biggest risk now? Because I'm seeing, yes, a startup can go out of business, but I'm also seeing enterprises lay people off right and left. And so if I was going out and just starting my career, I would be really concerned about where I should go. Should I go in startups? Because like you said, it's incredibly difficult to get out of the startup cycle. Me going from startups to enterprises was a huge transition where I had to do consulting first to those enterprises in order to get a job in enterprise. Because enterprise people like enterprise people that have that culture and understand how they work and move and understand that they move slow, whereas startup people don't want that. They want you to move really fast. And so oscillating between those two is really, really difficult.
Yeah, so part of it's obviously going to be your personal preference, right? What do you want to do? That's part of it. And people don't even ask these questions for themselves. They just like they're so desperate, they just want a job. And it's bad. It's bad for the companies who hire them too, because like you would want someone who's excited to be in a startup or something like that. You know what I mean? So one interesting thing, because you brought up that your friend went to Google. Another interesting thing that we found that I think applies to this is, if you work for a big name company, you are going to have a much easier time getting a job just in general.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, we did a test one time where we put Microsoft on a resume to see how many more interviews a certain person would get. And that same resume got 5% just without Microsoft. And it was like 27%, I think, with Microsoft. And that's not necessarily applying to other big companies. That's just applying in general. So it's like, you have to, and then maybe that's one of the benefits, like I was saying, where you need to be thinking, in the future as well. It's like, well, maybe, you could work at Microsoft, or you could work at this new up and coming startup. And it's like, well, if I do work at Microsoft, maybe there's a chance to get laid off. But, also I might not get laid off. And if I apply to, 10 or 15 jobs, I'm going to get interviews easily because I work at Microsoft. And they're like, he must be good because he works at Microsoft. And that's kind of what's going on right now. And I think that's also a bad thing as well, is it's like, well, now companies are judging people based on the company they work at instead of how good they are at something, which is another problem as well.
Yeah, I've got friends that are a bit older than me who worked for Microsoft, and then they went, this one person I know went to GM, and then they used Workday at GM, if you're familiar with Workday, and then now they're working for Workday, but they're bored. They're pretty bored in those roles. So you're making the case for a stable job or a job that looks good on your resume, but there's also the mind-numbingly boringness of being in those roles. So I was going to kind of like pull it into product again a little bit and say, like, I think you should be using these tools, even if you're not using it in your job, just to create little side projects. Like if it never sees the light of day, if it's just for like organizing your kids' soccer camp, just do it, because it's going to teach you so many creative ways to think about what you could be doing in organizations, these AI tools you could be using. And those, so my theory on AI is that we're going to be able to unlock the potential of these very practical people that have been left behind in the job market, people who are neurodiverse or dyslexic, who've maybe struggled academically, but are very, very good problem solvers. If you create these little side apps and you can say you can use Lovable and Cursor, and you build these little things and there's subjects you're talking about in interviews, then I think it's going to get you more jobs, because they know you can come in and fix problems.
And it's also interesting too, because a lot of big companies were started by someone just starting something on the side too.
Yes.
So you never know whenever you're going to figure out something that's actually really cool.
There's a term called the entrepreneur. We want to, I believe, a lot in creating people who are internal entrepreneurs. I think we should all start thinking like that, because now we're not reliant on a whole hive of people to create something. We can create something ourselves at home. And even if it comes to nothing, like I said, that prototype that I made for something internally that we're doing at Array, this was just a way to tell a story to my dev team and my partners in the team. But it taught me so much about the idea as well and thinking through it.
Yeah.
I think one thing that's really important as these consolidation of roles really happen, first of all, I would pick someone who is a founder or worked for a startup as a product manager over an enterprise person.
But is that just because of your insight, Adam?
Well,
I agree too, but
most people don't have that insight, and they would choose the opposite, right? But I will tell you, having worked in both, there's much more demand. There's much more stress and pressure and requirements to work at a startup than there is to work in an enterprise. And also, you have to think much more about commercialization when you work at a startup. I've met some really what looked like great on paper, Ivy League schools, master degreed product managers at big tech and things like that, but they could have put together a product vision to save their life, that would do anything on marketability. And one of the things I keep thinking about is Snapchat, who just recently laid off most of all their product management team because they said they can't commercialize anything. They just come up with ideas, but they don't commercialize anything. Nothing makes any money. And so one of the things that I keep thinking about in product that you should really learn is how to commercialize the idea and realize that your whole job is market viability. If you can't create something that is going to either lower churn or increase growth or do something on some key metric, then you really shouldn't be in product management. And so where are you going to learn how to do that? Startups.
Right. So you think that product management specifically is the place where you get the best product managers just because of the nature of what they're doing and how it really has to work, basically?
I think, working at a startup is where you should learn product management, because you're going to be forced to come up with commercialization. Now, I say that with one caveat. One of the biggest challenges that product management has working at a startup is if you work for the wrong startup founder.
Oh, yeah.
Because if you work for a startup founder who won't release the reins on product and the founder is too controlling on product, then you'll never learn anything. You'll be given a title of product manager, but you don't actually do anything. And I think that's one of the things that, a lot of people have fears of if they go and work in a startup is, I'm just going to be, I worked for a company where I was even a VP level and the founder wouldn't let me do anything, and so it's like, why am I here? And so I think that's one caveat. You really need to vet the founder much more on working for early stage startup or even late stage startup, and realize that, in product, you should have control over at least, some of the roadmap to go out there and do it.
Yeah, I think what's caused some of this is also the incentives and kind of where they are. Actually, Jace likes to talk a lot about this one thing Henry Ford did.
Yeah, so we actually had a small team to help us with the research that we've been doing over the past year, and I had a conversation with them, and I might butcher this story a little bit because it's one of those like kind of folklore things that's kind of changed a little bit of time. But basically, Henry Ford, in the beginning days of Ford, went up to his factory workers and even his management and said, "Hey, if you create a system, you create a product that helps us as a company, whether that is the bottom line, just making us more efficient, or if that is, making a new product, you will get a chunk of that. You either get a bonus, you'll get a percentage of the proceedings. And maybe it's unfortunate that maybe not everyone is an inner entrepreneur, but I think it's a great incentive to try encouraging your team to think of the next way to improve. So that's something that we use with our team.
It keeps them trying to be creative, at least. So if they're in a job where, like you said, they just don't feel like they have any meaning or purpose, at least they can be like, well, I can control the narrative myself a little bit more. And I think that was a really valuable thing that he did. And I mean, you probably do see it sometimes, and there's probably some companies that still try to apply something like that or something similar. But I do think it's something that would do a lot of good for companies to use.
Some VCs have an entrepreneur in residence, don't they? That work at the VC fund, and sometimes it's like they're going to take over a business. They might look for something and come in on it, but maybe big corporates need to look at that. Is like, adopting an entrepreneur for a little bit to come in and just work in the organization and try and add value and try and look at quicker ways to build things.
I think that's the biggest problem that enterprises have. I'm going to make a bold statement. I think that most enterprises lack spine. I think that's what they do. Most of their leadership team is just trying to keep their job, and so they don't want to rock the boat, and they'll just try to get as much approval through consensus. So all of them are essentially taking the blame if they all do it, and so then no one takes the blame. Mm-hmm. Whereas like founders, you know this as a founder, you guys know this as well, is that we take risk all the time, don't we? And we live with the consequences of that. Whereas in enterprise, the whole goal is to get to a point where you take no risk and you can just kind of sit there on meetings all day and pass the blame to other people. But I think, that goes back to your personal kind of track of what you want to go and actually do. Do you actually want to make an impact, or do you just want to make money? And that's a core question I think people need to ask themselves.
I think that if you focus on the impact, the money will follow. Mm-hmm. And I think an example of that would be the CEO, Brian Nickel. He's the CEO for Starbucks now. Before that was Chipotle, and then before that it was Taco Bell. And he's going through each one of these, just doing risky, I'm going to save the business. I'm going to change this. So at Taco Bell, their sales were really, really low. And he came up with the Live Moss campaign. And now it's the go-to thing for stoners to eat and stuff like that, which I don't know if that was intended, but it's a lot more popular now than it was 5 or 10 years ago. And then he went to Chipotle, and the issue was, okay, we need to actually make money, because Chipotle was the prices are too cheap. We have a lot of people that love us, but we need to make a little bit more money. We got to be making money. So he fixed that for them, and then now he got the CEO job for Starbucks, and I think he flies every morning for 2 hours from his home in California to get up there. It's he's getting this crazy treatment. It's he's playing chess. Everyone else is just I just got my job as a CEO. I can't ruin this. And he's well, I'm gonna go shake stuff up.
That's probably what Starbucks needs. But I think that's the opportunity for this AI revolution, is that corporates and enterprises are going to be slow to adopt and slow to change, and we can build companies that can be fast moving and disrupt them. And then these companies get acquired, they get bought into big private equity, and then they don't innovate anymore. So that's good. That's good. That's a good opportunity for us.
But that's not new,
I think,
though, man. That's been going on for
I was going to say, if you think they have their spine now, just wait till it's automated and it's AI doing it. Then it's really just going to...
Yeah, because you talk to AI, it doesn't want to give it to you straight. So it's
well, I think that's what I'm seeing is, you listen to what Y Combinator just said, and they said, we don't even want to fund companies that are just selling to enterprises anymore. We want companies that are going to displace the enterprises, meaning for example, one of the things that they were saying with legal tech is that it'd be much better for you to create a legal tech startup that's actually a law firm. So you go out and you create
I don't understand.
See, that's how good AI is. She doesn't understand.
Yeah, she doesn't understand. So essentially going out and saying, rather than create products to serve an enterprise, go create an enterprise for yourself as a service-based business that's enabled by this software.
I have seen that with someone else. I was speaking to an investor this week, and they're we don't want a feature that someone else could eventually build. We want you to completely redefine a market. Mm-hmm. So I want to get some final thoughts off people. So should we start with Matt? Sure. So what are your thoughts generally on some of these AI tools, the state of them? How fast are we going to see this disruption happening?
I actually think that there's going to be a period of time where people are going to really, really, really benefit from adopting them quickly. And I think you see that with, every new innovation that comes out. I think there'll be a period of time where it's if you get the jump on this, you're going to be highly rewarded for that. And then it'll start to be massively adopted. And then if you're not too careful, you're going to be on the other end of that. And, there's only, jobs are created, right? But, really in a lot of ways, there's a set amount, at a certain time, and it doesn't go up too much, and sometimes it goes down, right? So if you're not really one of those people, you kind of get left behind. So what we want to do is we just kind of want to make sure that doesn't happen to people. And then you've got agentic AI, which should start coming out pretty soon, and we don't know what to expect with that. If it does work, it's going to be, obviously 2 or 3 years ago, AI was way different than it is now. So, yes, these tools may take some time. Maybe they're not doing a lot of things right, but they still have a lot of funding, and there's a lot of money going to them. And at ChatGPT got $100 billion to just keep doing what they're doing. That's a lot of money. Like they're going to try to make
You have a
it
big
good.
amount of that to Johnny Ives.
Yeah.
So.
They're going to try to make it very good. That's what they're going to try to do. And, with $100 billion, you can get pretty far. So
Yeah, you can make something happen. Adam, what are your thoughts, man?
I think, the thing that I keep thinking about is if you're looking at it, I'm going to give you a point of view from two kind of roles. One, as an employee, if I was looking at hiring, a PM or, someone who's wanting to go be a PM, I think that I would look at what breadth they have of knowledge, meaning do they understand things like Figma Make? Do they understand like Cursor? Do they understand basic engineering principles and things like that? And they should have a breadth of knowledge across all of those. But I would say that I want to see a depth of knowledge around commercialization, go-to-market strategy, growth, and churn mitigation.
Nice, man.
Yeah, so I think I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about your point about how you're talking about whenever a company gets to a certain size, they don't really innovate anymore. Mm-hmm. Like Google, really, maybe they outsource the majority of their innovation and, with acquisitions and stuff like that. And I think that, you're going to see really, their motivation really at this point is to their shareholders. They're public now. And ultimately, a massive motivation for them is automation and reducing their headcount and doing these things because that's obviously directly to how much money they make. Mm-hmm. So I think what you're probably going to see is a lot of tools that get funded just because in general, there's Cursor, there's Lovable, they're very similar, but ultimately they can just kind of wait until something is good enough. Maybe they do an acquisition, maybe they don't. They kind of just use that and kind of outsource. So ultimately the best thing that you can do just as somebody in any role is try to figure out ways that you can make yourself more effective. Because in the short term right now, specifically over the next 5-10 years, AI may not take your job necessarily, but somebody who uses AI better than you may.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of key initially to kind of focus on it.
Yeah, no, true.
I think when it comes to AI, I mean, I was having a conversation on LinkedIn with this gentleman who's been out of work for 17 months. It is, with that, that's as demoralizing as it gets, I would say. And the fact of, I think you're taught this as a kid and you're taught this in college, but I think, I love talking to older people like my grandparents and just hearing their wisdom, and it's never stopped learning. So even if you, whether you mean to or not, you get complacent in a role and you're like, oh, I know the programs, I'm going to use it. Mm-hmm. I think you always need to be searching to how to get better in that role. Mm-hmm. And I think, unfortunately, I think there's a lot of things that brought the job market down, and a lot of them are from the enterprises like we talked about and the lack of innovation. Mm-hmm. But complacency is part of it too, not wanting to get better personally.
Yeah. My last thoughts are I mentor quite a few young people on different subjects. There's one guy who's like, I want to do website stuff. And he was starting to learn WordPress and he was starting to code websites. And I said, dude, I think you should learn Webflow. I think that's the thing you can make the most money from and get a product. You can get templates and start hacking them. But I said to him, once he sort of got that, started getting that, I said, dude, you really need to learn Figma. I think Figma is going to really help you kind of become a better visual designer. And I said, but just keep with Webflow, keep doing Figma, and maybe look at Framer, I said as well. I think Framer's got some issues though. But I said, you need to spend like once a day on Figma Make, Figma sites, and making sure you're proficient with GPT, because as soon as they're good enough, you'll be the expert in them because you would have seen the innovations along the way. Because even though they're not up to snuff yet, it will happen very quickly. So if you could just be tinkering around on them for a bit, even though they might not be commercially viable, I think you're going to be well ahead. And I spoke to him a week or so ago. He says, "Oh my God, Matt, like Figma is awesome." I was like, "I know, right?" So learn how to layer things correctly, turn components. If you're getting things like a neat little components now, you're going to be unstoppable. So that's my thoughts on it. So on that, I think we'll leave that there. I think it was a good first one. That was our inaugural kind of product pod. And I like the angle that we took around kind of recruitment and upskilling as well. So I want to thank you guys for being on the product pod. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. It was a great time.
Very good.